Right, good morning. I can see we've got some people starting to join us here. Anya, welcome. Mark and I already are on the line with a collection of people from Duke of Edinburgh around the world. There are going to be a lot of accents today. Maria, Avneet, Maria Helena, Samson, lovely to have you with us today. We're going to give everybody a couple of minutes to join in, join up, get your microphones going, get your screens going, and all the things that we have to do last thing at night, first thing in the morning, depending on where we are in the world. Ben, lovely to have you. Morning, Tamsin. Morning, Theophilus. How are you? Excited to have you all with us. We're going to continue letting people join for a couple of minutes, just because when you start at 1 minute past the hour, a minute later feels like a really long time, and you wonder, what on earth is everyone doing? But then you remember all those times where you were 20 seconds behind everybody. So we're going to move not quite as fast to start, and then we're going to move fast through some questions and welcome yours once we kick off. Thank you from the good mornings. Victoria in British Columbia, Cape Town, fantastic. You can probably hear from my accent I'm in London. I am usually in Los Angeles, and Mark will tell us where he is when we start firing questions at him. He's getting ready to be in the hot seat. He's warming up and enjoying his first couple of minutes just to breathe. Don't forget, everybody, it's lovely to have the chat functional, because part of this is an alumni network, and it's great to make cross connections. There is a function here for you to put your questions into the forum. Oh, the Azores. Wow, we really are covering Nigeria. We're covering so many countries this morning. This is really fantastic, and this is the beauty of the Duke of Edinburgh Award. Queensland, fantastic. I'm getting a little taste now of what it's like to host the Oscars on Zoom. So I'm really enjoying this, and I'm getting ready for my invite in 2023 for the big show, which I feel like I'm ready for. Australia, Sydney, we've got Peter, good morning. I think what we'll do is we'll aim to start at 5 past the hour. 2 o'clock in the morning, Avneet, that is serious dedication to stay awake. This almost is the Oscar ceremony, one of the very few things I probably would be forced out of bed for. Not even sure that would be true. Brilliant. Well, we've got a couple more people signing up, but I think what we'll do is we'll let them get set up. And I am going to kick off this morning's Alumni Connect. For those of you that don't know me, it's lovely to be here. My name is Emma Sinclair. I am a tech entrepreneur, and I run an enterprise software company. We provide alumni software. So in actual fact, this is all about alumni, and my middle name is Alumni. I'm also an alumni of Duke of Edinburgh. I remember doing it at 15 years old. I can see people are from around the world, so there's different weathers, but very quickly, my experience with Duke of Edinburgh was wonderful. It's where I made one of my closest friends, who is still one of my closest friends today, known to me at school as Cher, now Dr. Sherry Jacobson. And we had our most defining friendship early moment, trying to put up a tent in some terrible rain, in some muddy fields in the United Kingdom. Inside out, it turned out. We knew this by the morning when we got wet. We had some terrible froze-dried dinner. All in all, I think that we are the least likely people who will ever be asked to lead a Duke of Edinburgh Gold expedition. However, it was wonderful. We made great friends, and that's really part of what Duke of Edinburgh and the International Award is about. So this morning, we are very lucky to have Mark McCrindle with us, and we're going to ask him to introduce himself and say a few little words. And then I've got some questions to really just kick off and understand what Mark does, because I always knew I wanted to be an entrepreneur. But when someone says they're a futurist, I'm like, what on earth? How on earth did you get there? What kind of a journey is it to get to a title like that? So Mark, perhaps you can tell everyone a little bit about your work journey, and then I've got some Duke of Edinburgh questions for you too.
Sure. Well, delighted to be with you all, and you, Emma, and thanks all for joining in. I always have had an interest in people, and so I finished school and studied psychology, and then went on to social psychology, sociology essentially, and did a master's degree furthering in that field. And that's the field that I'm in as a social researcher, taking the pulse of communities, trying to understand sentiment, trying to understand groups and societies and generations as well. We've had the great opportunity now over a couple of decades just researching the different generations, finding out some different insights. We do a lot of demographic analysis and forecasting as well. And I guess, all of that gives us a bit of a sense into where attitudes are headed, where societies are headed, indeed where the generations are headed. That's where that future forecasting comes into play. So now that's the fun field I get to work in on a daily basis.
Well, we're looking forward to hearing exactly how the world's going to be shortly. So I certainly am going to get some questions in there that I want to get on top of. But first of all, so Mark, you also were a Duke of Edinburgh participant. So are you, I mean, it's not a competition, but are you bronze, silver or gold? Do you have any fond memories of your time and anecdotes you might want to share just to kick us off, because that's ultimately what unites us all?
Yes, I'm a big fan of the award. I achieved the gold myself. In fact, I was thinking,
Mark, embarrassing me.
I found my little record book. This is back in the day when you had to fill it in. None of these apps and digital era. So that goes back to the early 1990s when 18-year-old self did that one. And like yourself, Emma, had some interesting times putting up tents in the snowy mountains here in New South Wales and on that expedition, as well as the skills and the service, of course, and the residential. I just found the experience quite formative for me, and it does teach you a lot about self-organization. It does teach you about setting objectives and moving towards it. And of course, that interaction, it steps you out of your comfort zone. And I've seen with a lot of young people I've worked with since, and now indeed my own children moving through the program, I see the benefits of it firsthand. So yeah, big fan of the International Award and how it can really help young people move forward in their lives in terms of setting goals and objectives and achieving them.
Brilliant. And we look forward to seeing in chat other people's memories. But I'm convinced that the organisers of this always put someone on as a gold, because they know that I failed miserably to put up a tent, got very wet and was a complete disaster. But I guess we all excel in different ways. So I guess, Mark, let's move into a couple of questions from me and inviting, I can see the attendee numbers growing, and great to see Monica, Stella, some other people, Phyllis joining us, who will no doubt have some questions themselves. So I mean, you talked to us about social science and just your career trajectory. And ultimately, we all start by having an education and start, no doubt, thinking we want to go here, and we end up there. I think, had an underbelly of wanting to be an entrepreneur. I had various other jobs, that led to me starting a business, but it was just kind of always in me. And so I just want to understand, what was that journey to being a futurist? Because of course there is studying and social psychology and people, but is that something you wanted to do when you grow up? Was that something that inspired you, or is it that along the way you started to see trends and you thought, I understand this space? I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Well, it's definitely, as you said there, it's heading in a certain direction and then finding a closed door or finding a preferable pathway and moving there. That's the great thing about heading somewhere, about momentum, is that you might not head in a straight line, but it is helpful in directing that pathway. So for me, I thought it might be psychology and headed towards the clinical psych pathway, realized that wasn't quite for me. However, I did enjoy, the interaction of people and how people and groups think. And so moved, as I said, more to the behavioral sciences in terms of analyzing societies and communities. For me, it was in the early 2000s, seeing a lot of great research take place, but not communicated very well to a market audience, to a time-poor audience. A lot of those reports would sit on the shelf of the organization that commissioned the research, but they wouldn't really action it. And so we worked very hard from the early days to try to visualize that data. The world of infographics was just emerging, visual reports, and trying to communicate content in ways that could be quickly consumed and seen, not just read. I also worked pretty hard in trying to communicate that in a verbal sense, through presentations and through briefings of the organization. Moving through then to the application side of it, and another big thing was combining the different disciplines. It's one thing to run focus groups or in-depth interviews, but then you've also got to look at the data and the data analytics, not just of what people are saying, but of the behaviors of the actual outcomes. And then, as I said, demographics is a key part of that, because by studying community, which really is people, we can understand how that community is changing, get a sense as to where that's going. And so all of those, I guess, data sets do start to help us triangulate a bit on the future, on the direction, and that leads to that futurist work. So, that was all, I guess, iterative and took place over time as my disciplines and career developed.
And how do you choose projects, Mark? Because I'm imagining that when you look at data and research, or somebody wants to commission you, or you notice a trend, some people like the outcome and some people don't. The world changes, which I guess is ultimately what you're looking at. How does the world change and what is it going to look like? How do you choose the projects you work on, and how do you make sure, is there a challenge to be independent through these?
Yeah, that's a great question. For us, because it's social research, it's not just market research. So it's not so much about advertising effectiveness. For us, it's about people, communities, organizations, and society. So we have the great privilege of trying to look for areas where we can measure social impact, where we can analyze what might be a preferred pathway for an organization, a not-for-profit, or a community, and where we can introduce instruments to help us really measure an area. Everything from archetypes that can help us understand a customer segment or a group, to even other forms of interaction, of, if you like, splash pages or websites where people can fill in their own instrument to understand their attitude to food, or their perception of the future, or what might be a built environment that they want to grow into or move into. And so these tools, these instruments, these dashboards are what we try to develop as outputs of the research. We believe research is at its best when it's set free, when it's publicly available. And so we try to make all of our research freely accessible. And again, really encouraging the client to find a way of turning that research, that report, that data into something to help people and communities understand something of themselves, to, as it were, put a mirror up there for society so they can understand a bit about themselves, and therefore that can lead to better directions and outcomes.
Yeah, I guess when we often float through blissfully unaware of what's going on around us, not necessarily purposely, but just sometimes you don't really think about what's happening to everybody. You think about your own little microcosm. And you talk there about perceptions of the future. And I'm wondering, you've been doing this a little while. Love to hear about a perception that you think might be really relevant to the audience that you worked on. And I know there's a long list here and I don't want to pick because you'll tell us. And is there a perception of the future that you really thought the world was going in earlier on, which you can see has gone a completely separate way? So love to hear a perception that worked out and a perception that went in a slightly different direction. Yeah,
great. Well, what's relevant at the moment is COVID and the global pandemic. And that was, it's a social researcher's once in a lifetime opportunity to measure a society, to measure our human responses during such an occurrence. And we were all aware of the dark clouds of this pandemic, and we've seen the downsides of it. And when times are tough, you can get this sense where people move towards an individualism, where they can sort of lock themselves away from society and care more for themselves. What we found consistently, though, during this pandemic is the opposite to that, and that is that communities have come together, that people have been focused on others, that they have been self-aware, and where there has been some of this, I guess, locking down and social distancing and the like, it's been out of a concern rather than a fear. We've seen upsides, a silver lining, if you like, to the tragedies over the last couple of years of this pandemic, in terms of people reflecting and reassessing life, reprioritizing their values, spending more time relationally with family, and working out their own direction. We, in the business of life, probably pre-pandemic, didn't get a lot of time to reflect and to analyze, but this period has given us that. We've seen an emerging generation that were often labeled as living for the here and now, the snowflake generation, as they were called, without any sense of resilience or grit. Well, actually, they've shown the opposite to that, this real ability to be adaptive and resilient. They have experienced a pretty tough coming of age couple of years, and yet they've rolled with that, even though they haven't been able to have graduations or 21st or 18th, or a lot of these coming of age milestones. And yet they have, with good courage and good humor, moved forward through this, adapted to online learning and to online working from home, and have done well through it. So probably for me, that was a little, I guess, global case study. And we've conducted this study in a few countries now to see that as societies, we have responded differently to what some of the stereotypes might have portrayed, to what maybe our intuition might have been. And it does once more reinforce that. In fact, it was Carl Rogers, the psychologist, that said, what is most personal is most universal. And so those individual fears and uncertainties we saw writ large across the community, but in the same way, people coming together for the sake of others and building a life even through the dark clouds of the uncertainties of the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I mean, what is most personal is most universal, I'm sure resonates with all of us, because we all felt the same. Yeah. And were you surprised by the way that you saw people responding? Because part of what you do is you help us to understand what might happen, what the world might look like in 2030, what might be the future of business or education or whatever else it might be. How we respond to it is really on all of us. Are people's responses something that surprise you, or do you think because I feel like the work, the thinking about what the future looks like is perhaps quite a little bit intellectual. Do you still have to use your intuition about how people are going to respond?
Yeah, you definitely do, and it's a case where you'll often have a hypothesis to how you think this survey will come back, or this in-depth analysis, this qualitative insight might progress, but you often are surprised when you find something different. I mean, a classic example, just generally as we think about the future, we tend to think that society heads in one direction. It's like a one-way street heading further and further in a pathway. But actually, the last couple of years has reinforced what we've probably always known if we've looked at history, and that is that society, the future, our response is more like a pendulum. Society will swing one way and then it'll recorrect and swing the other way. And an example of that is how we have seen a new conservatism emerge with younger people, where job security matters once more, where savings matters, where they're valuing the real world interactions, not just the cyber or virtual ones, where they still want that dream of home ownership or something solid, not just bidding everything on cyber currencies and the metaverse, and so again, it's that reality of the timeless human needs and conditions do dominate even amongst the emerging trends and the changing times. So yes, it's a new generation in a new era with new expectations and outlooks, but with some of the same core values, expectations that we've seen, and in a lot of ways, they resemble their grandparents even more than their times, such has been the response. Like we saw through World War II or the Great Depression, tough times create a response back to valuing jobs, security, savings, and planning for the future.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And I mean, I had a question about the power of confidence, which sometimes you talk about, and you talk about confidence in leadership. But before Peter goes, he's got a question, and it might be great to just get that in early on. He said, can you please comment on how the notion of trust has been changing with younger generations, increasingly starting with a no trust position and trust being earned? This compares to prior generations where the base was to trust, and then one learned to reassess that trust. I mean, essentially, that's a little bit about what you're talking about, the kind of values that perhaps we feel might have been lost somewhat are being recreated. Would love you to talk a little bit about the notion of trust and how people feel differently depending on their age group.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, trust historically has been something that was linked to authority, and there was a sense that someone in authority or someone with gravitas or someone with a legacy had with them an inherent trust that we would adopt. We don't see that as much now. Another aspect of trust that's changed is that it was in a lot of ways intergenerational. One's parents trusted this brand, and so when you start your own household, oh, mum bought this brand or dad liked this brand, we will carry that on. We're seeing that break from the intergenerational transfer of trust in brands, organizations, political parties, or indeed historical figures as well. So there has been a difference with the emerging generation where trust is through one's own experience. It's far more experiential, where it starts almost at a zero balance and it has to be proved or shown, where trust is based on a resonance with one's own values rather than a set of accepted timeless ones, and where trust can be broken quite quickly. Perhaps there's less grace or resilience around trust compared to what we used to have, where we could roll with it on the balance. There's no one's perfect. They've built high trust in the trust account. Maybe then there was a little slip up, but on balance, we'll accept it. That's changed a little, and people can be a bit more reactive in how they respond to a perceived breach. And that's part of, I guess you might say, the cancel culture. But the good news on this is that young people are more tuned into this issue of trust and are wanting to be people that are trustworthy themselves, recognizing the importance of that, even as a digital currency in a world where we don't always get to build relationship with people in a physical sense. We have to base through those digital interactions whether we're going to trust someone or not. So that's part of the new reality, and we do make those decisions very quickly these days.
Yeah, super helpful and super informative. And thank you very much for that question, Peter. Brilliant. And do keep them coming. I'm happy to interrupt Mark every now and then with the things that you think about as he's speaking. And, Mark, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was you talk a lot about the trends transforming organizations. And some people here might be running organizations. Some people in the sort of group today might be working their way up the corporate career ladder, and some might be thinking about entering it and still at university. So I wondered if you had any tips from your research about what really matters to organizations when you are interviewing. It's not just about skills, but it's about how you present yourself, and it's about showing that you're an adaptive person. Do you have some tips for people that are starting their career or who are moving through their career journey?
Yeah, totally. Well, if we think about the business landscape today, we've got flatter structures and we've got smaller organizations or fewer people relative to the output. So we have to get by on leaner numbers. We're using technology for efficiency. There might be a sense where we're using externals rather than full-time equivalent staff members. But the point of that is to say that if young people coming into a career can add value to the organization, not just think of themselves as someone within a chain of command, a cog in a wheel, but actually someone who can show some ownership, show some vision, some entrepreneurialism in their own right, and add value in that organization. That's important today. Or leaders are looking for people who themselves can show leadership and can step up. What's important as well these days is to be able to communicate effectively, because our workforces are far more diverse. And that's not just cultural diversity, language diversity, but we're connecting in a global world with clients, customers, or team members that might be in different parts of the world. Intergenerational communication is key as well. So having the ability to be a leader, to add value, to think like an entrepreneur, and to communicate effectively is key. Probably the final thing I would say there is to think with a service mindset. Here we are as alumni of the International Award, and one of the key aspects there is service. And it's great to have that instilled early on, where we think, how can I serve other people or a community or a marginalized group? How can I help them? And I think if we bring that mindset to business, that will transform us as well, because we're serving customers, we're serving team members, we're serving the community in which we are based. We're focused not just on profits or ROIs in that sense, but we're focused on how we can add value, create human flourishing, bring about a better outcome through the privilege we have of commerce, of economics, of capitalism, to make this world, or our little part of it, a better place through serving. And leaders today look for that in their team members. It's part of the social contract. It's part of the impacts that we look for. And so if someone has a service mindset, that's important these days as well.
I totally agree. And, a better outcome is subjective. And when I think about hiring, of course, you're looking for a skill. And if you need to know how to do something in particular for a job role, That's a given. But I know that I look for humor or a little bit of empathy or a little bit of just personable behavior. Because ultimately, whilst you need to do a day job, you also need to interact with other people. And we want people that are genuinely happy to be with us, but also pleasant to be around and respectful to colleagues. So, I ultimately think everything is service and customer service. After D&V, I worked in McDonald's for years. I used to make a mean bag of chips and a hamburger. Not so good these days. Now I'm vegan. But ultimately, it was part of being a team. And I think that's what made me successful there and allowed me to build relationships, because I have relationships from people I met on the D&V. I have relationships from McDonald's and places 20, 25 years ago where I interacted. And I think people shouldn't be shy to show a little of themselves. The other thing, Mark, I'd love your point in is I often think if you show a little bit of yourself and you don't get a yes, it can actually be for the best, because maybe you're not in the best place for you. So we'd love to hear also about, do you have any views on that? Because I think we all feel a need to fit in. And the great thing about D&V is you can, it's not a sort of extremely linear little pocket of a type of a person you have to be, right? You explore, you are part of a service culture, and it's much bigger than just you need to do this or you need to do that. Any thoughts on finding the right place for you and not being afraid to say no or not being right home?
Well, it's a great point, Emma, and your own journey is a great example of that. When we start off with just whatever job we can get our hands on, and often they are the hard work jobs, the McDonald's, the service industries. We're in a knowledge economy, but I don't think people should expect to start off as entrepreneurs in this knowledge economy. Putting a bit of sweat into something, putting your back into something through physical work, starting at the bottom is a noble way to start. And yes, it might not be a direct pathway from there to your future, to your ideal career, but the best pathways are those circuitous ones, because we pick up a lot of skills. We're in the era of the generalist, the era of people who need to be bridge builders. And that comes from working hard in an array of eras and areas and sectors, being someone who can work at the bottom, being the laborer, not just the boss, and earning our stripes over time. That is an invaluable opportunity. And so it's not just about the direct path. It's not just about getting the yes. In fact, when we're starting out in a role, what we learn matters far more than what we earn. And so as long as you're learning in the early years of those roles, picking up skills, and the people skills, the transferable skills. It's not so much about that particular job, because you may never work in that sector again, but it's all the add-ons and the learning that's key. That'll, as you've just shared now, Emma, serves you for the rest of your life in all those other endeavors. And I think it's an important place to start.
100%. Sets you in good stead, right? When the going gets tough, you know how to roll up your sleeves. And if you never really did that, it's a pretty hard lesson to learn later in life. We've got quite a few questions coming in, so we'll go to some of those. We've got one from Declan who asks, what are the prospects for Generation COVID in terms of global wellbeing and connectivity? How can the Duke of Edinburgh International Award help to address the challenge of tomorrow and ensure that vulnerable groups and individuals are not left behind? Thank you for that question, Declan. We'll let the hard job, which is the answer, go to Mark.
Well, it's a time where more than ever we need to be outward focused. But I think that what COVID has done is made us more internationally aware. We've looked out of our own household to our communities, to our nation, to other nations. Never before have we had all of this data of how other nations are faring, and we're very well aware of that. Some countries have responded better than other countries, and we've seen other countries and areas in more need than perhaps our own. And so that's an important start, where we're just more aware of how others are traveling. We're more tuned into that and more globally minded amidst it. And of course, the International Award does help us. It's an international award by its very title. It helps us be aware of the other and builds those international bonds, even through this little Zoom conference, as we're getting a chance to do that today. So I think the future of the Duke of Edinburgh and the International Award will be to continue those international connections, to continue that service, to look out for others where we can serve and make a difference. And COVID has further exacerbated that. So, it's going to be important from here and ongoing to do that. The pandemic, the health impacts will pass. So we know historically pandemics last 2 to 3 years from the medical side. But the mental health side, the social impact side, the economic side, the political unrest side may well roll on for many years to come. So there's going to be a lot more bridge building and healing and solving to come, even after we get through the acute side of the health aspect of it.
Yeah, and knowing people share that journey with you is wonderful. You know, for me, it's 8 o'clock in the morning in the United Kingdom when we started this. We're talking to people in Sydney, we're talking to people in Melbourne, we're talking to people in the Azores, in Nigeria, you know, all over the world. And it's just, you know, I think it helps everybody to feel part of a community. We've got a couple more questions, and a really interesting one that we have here from Fuad, who says, we come from an Islamic school in Indonesia that uses a pesantren education system that does not allow students to freely access social media or the internet. Can you suggest some ways to provide students with impactful insights into social projects so they can achieve globally? And that's a really interesting and great one, because I think, Mark, you know, I love Twitter. Other people read books, magazines, you know. When I started work and when I started to want to explore the world, it just simply wasn't, you know, it wasn't even that long ago, but there simply wasn't the access to the outside world in the same way. People I find interesting write books, and I can write them letters if I want to. I still have a collection of letters from someone when I was in my teens who I found inspiring, who replied to me. Those things are still there. So I'd love some views from you about some of the things that Fuad can be doing whilst at school, where social media isn't necessary and internet isn't necessarily freely accessed.
Well, we find in trends analysis that when there is a particular trend in one direction, there are great opportunities to look for the counter trend. And that's true at an individual level as well. So everyone, you know, most around the world in your age group, as you write this question, are on social media. They're all consuming the content. But you have an opportunity, because you know you don't have that connection as much, to find an alternate, a counter trend and a point of difference, which is contrary to the mass direction of everyone else. So what is happening with everyone else in a world of social media is that they are consuming very broadly and very shallow content. You have the opportunity to do a bit of old school opportunities to go deep into a particular area, and through books and through the traditional content, that's where you can do it. We spend a lot of time on social media. It consumes a lot of time. Screen time is way up, we have found, with the emerging generation in our world today. And there can be a lot of distractions in that. There can be sometimes not much of a return on all of that time that we spend. But if you're not given to that distraction, if it's not even part of your world, you do have the opportunity in your youth to read deeply, to study in terms of, you know, robust content, and that can be accessed through books, not just online. So, you know, I think that finding unique skills in the midst of the mass is great. To look for the retro amidst the contemporary, and books, if you've got access there, and some of the traditional ways, even just the access to elders, to those living books in your community, and digging deep by asking the input of others will add not information in a digital sense, but it'll add wisdom, it'll add gravitas, it'll add a philosophical understanding, a relational skill, and that in the long term matters more than reading the tweet. We say read the street matters more than reading the tweet, and you can all do that even without social media.
100%, and ultimately, you know, the bigger, the richer our treasure chest of our independent thought processes, or at least the knowledge that we've built up, the more that we are able to respond as we grow in time. And you know, no doubt once you leave education, there'll be different things potentially available to you. I think, you know, if everybody is reading and thinking the same thing, it doesn't really lead to you know, the most fantastic of outcomes. So in many ways, what an opportunity to have some independence of thought. Very, you know, fantastic question. We've got a question from Jury. Mark, can you please reflect on the importance of reinventing yourself, building resilience and enjoyment, and constantly exploring your limits and horizons?
Yeah, such a great question. We are in this 21st century where longevity around the world is not only greater than it's ever been, but it continues to increase. It's a remarkable situation. And so that means that this generation alive today will not only live longer than prior generations, but will be able to work later in life. You know, the contribution years of our life are extending. And so that means that we will have longer in the workforce. We will have longer to make those contributions. And that means more opportunities to reinvent. In fact, a requirement to do so, because technologies, careers, industries, occupations are changing so quickly. And you contrast that with this longer period of contribution to the workforce, which we estimate now is going to be close to 6 decades. You know, we'll be working well through our 70s now. So what that means is that you will have to reinvent, you'll have to upskill, retrain, plug in. Lifelong learning is a new reality, not just for school leavers, for all of us today, to remain relevant and future-proofed. We've done some analysis on this, and we estimate that the average school leaver today will have 18 separate jobs in their lifetime, and they'll upskill and retrain every 3 or so jobs. So they'll have 6 separate careers. Every 3 or so jobs, in other words, our job description has changed so much, or the industry we're in has changed so much, or maybe it's just our employment situation has changed from being an employee now a contractor or an owner-operator or perhaps an entrepreneur, that it's a new career. So 6 separate careers across 18 careers in an ever-increasing lifetime. Therefore, reinvention, upskilling, retraining matters today more than it ever has in the past.
Yeah, and Mark, you know, I sometimes think to myself, I went to university at 18, you know, I did DV when I was in my later teens, and won't disclose how young I am now, but 25 years later, you know, we talk about this long period that we're going to be working. Really, I feel like there should be a break in the middle for education, because there is no real time. And as we all know, once you get started, it's hard to get off the train. How do you take that break in a busy world?
Yeah, it's a great point. You know, we hear a lot about micro-credentialing, about just-in-time training, about online learning, you know, and juggling that in amidst our roles. I think that's great. You know, it does mean that we can pick up those little skills and we can remain ever relevant. However, if we think about our university years or even our other periods of foundational education, what it did was it meant that we were focused on that education, and with that, focused on life direction and some of the other aspects that comes with that period of full-time education. So as you've said, Emma, I think there's something profound about taking time out of a career. There used to be talk in a lot of industries about a sabbatical. You know, maybe every 7 or 10 years is a time to take a period out of the workforce. It might be 3 or 6 months, might be a chance to, if we're in the position where we can fund our life for a little while there, a few months or longer, a chance to pick up a new skill or start into something. Maybe we can finish the qualification while we're back in the workforce, but something about the pause from the job so that we don't just get stuck into what we're doing because it's what we've been doing. Pause the momentum so we can reflect. And that's what COVID has done. We've all heard maybe this term, the great resignation, that's emerging as people have sort of had this pause put upon them and they've said, you know what, I'm not really enjoying that career, or that was a toxic workplace, or I just couldn't resonate with those colleagues, or I just feel I'm not doing my best or delivering my best. And when we had the day-to-day work, commuting in there, doing it every day, we didn't have a time to reflect. Now we have had this work from home. We've gone, you know what, I don't think I want to go back to that. And I think that can be a healthy thing. Now, we're not always going to have a pandemic, which gives us the opportunity to reflect. Sometimes we've got to schedule those. Yeah, let's hope. But if we can schedule those things in ourselves, that's a great thing to do. And probably need more than just a 1-week break to do it. We might need to schedule every few jobs a time for reinvention and adaptation. And we will have hopefully the chance to do that reflecting.
I need to do that better. I know the advice. I don't necessarily practice what I preach. And, you know, my grandpa always said to me, you know, you'll never say you wish you spent more time at work, which is in fact probably where I spend more time than anywhere else. But a moment to reflect is, you know, whether it's a moment or a minute or a week, I think that's an important learning, right? That you did your learning in your teens. Surely you need to do a little bit more now. We've got just a little bit of time left. So I have a couple of questions, unless others do. There was one thing I particularly wanted to ask you about before we head into the final furlong. You know, I think a lot about food. I've been vegan for a good 20 years. I've been vegetarian for most of my life, I said more than 35 years. And I know that you were part of the Food Karma Index. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what that was, because the moment I read that, I fell in love with it before I even had a look at what it was. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it was just an instrument that we developed for an organization that's into health food. That's what they produce. Freedom Foods is the company name, and they wanted, and this was Australian research, Australians to just reflect a little on not just the food they eat, but their relationship to food, which is not something we often think about. So we put together through research a survey, an interactive website where people could answer. I think there were 20 questions, and then it would come up with a food karma index, and there were questions around the priority of food in your life, a little bit about the type of food that is our go-to, something about our upbringing, because those formative years and the family upbringing often shapes our attitude to food almost at a subconscious level. We wanted to get a reflection on that. We looked at any particular dietary focuses or even concerns or fears that people have around food. And then there were just some general food likes and types and that sort of thing. And it created a bit of an index, and it came out with a food karma report. And with each of these, you'd fill in the survey, and it would also spit back some information saying, okay, you've got a sort of a high-end response here. Here are some things to consider. Here are some reflection points for you. And it was a great study that helped a lot of Australians just sort of reflect very simply on their relationship to food, something we don't do very much, and pick up a few tips on how they can reestablish more healthy eating. And as we know, we need to move more in our lives. We need the exercise side, but we also need to focus a bit on the nutrition side. And often it's more sentiment, attitudinal, emotional than it is just a lack of knowledge around food. We all know the food pyramid and all of that. So that's what the Food Karma Index did, and it was a helpful little output.
I read, Mark, 1 in 10 Australians think that bacon is a superfood, and 3 in 10 said they thought that they ate chocolate every day. So what I was really relieved about when I dug into it, because I think our relationship with food, the relationship with the earth matters. What you put in helps you to perform. And I was expecting with my head on of Australia, beach, healthy. All my Australian friends are just about as buff as anyone gets, always, for their entire lives. And I was expecting to read a lot about greens and spinach, but I was very relieved when I saw that about chocolate. So it threw up some interesting results I saw there. Yes,
it did. And the business of life, here and around the world, I think causes us to maybe take a few shortcuts. And that was part of it as well. We had a bit more takeaway than we probably should. But again, that's a big outcome from COVID. Now people are baking more. Sourdough's made a comeback. Vegetable gardens out the back, and people really thinking about their nutrition and slower food as they eat it together as a family, not just in front of the screen. So all of that has been a good outcome that's helped us all. Another silver lining of COVID.
Yeah, and a good reminder. I'm going to get myself off to the gym after this. I guess we've got time for maybe one more question. Just I know that we aim to tail off at around 1:45 to give people time to get to their next meetings. We're in 2022. It's the road to 2030. We'd love to hear a couple of thoughts to leave us with about what we'll be buying, what we'll be doing on the road to 2030. Could you leave us with a few things that we should have in the back of our minds that we should either be preparing for or we should be expecting to see over the coming years?
Well, in 2030, the population would have continued to grow, and this sort of global migration that we see and the cultural diversity across countries will continue to be a thing. But a big counter trend that we're seeing is that it's not just the global cities that we're dominating, but we're seeing a return to regional areas. We're seeing people right around the world re-engage once more in those secondary cities and those regional areas, chasing not just the urban spaces that might be walkable communities close to CBDs and workplaces, but now the lifestyle that often comes from less populated areas where there's often more affordability as well. So that's a bit of a global trend away from the mega city and to reconsider regional living. We're seeing emerging generations. So Generation Alpha will be the dominant generation of household formers. And
what's Generation Alpha? Can you tell us what that means?
Yes, well, we worked our way through the alphabet with Generation X. That's I'm in that category, and Generation Y or Millennials, Generation Z. And each of these generations spans 15 years. So from 2010 through to 2024, there's a new generation, and they are called Generation Alpha. Having got to the end of the alphabet, we're not going back to A, because it's not a repeat of what we had. It's the start of a whole new generation and a whole new millennium, and they're the alphas. They're the children of millennials, or Gen Y, called Generation Alpha. So they, while they're the primary age children and they're still just being born, they will be the largest generation in history. In 2030, they will comprise almost 2.5 billion people, and they will be this digital, global, social, mobile, and visual generation emerging and really transforming how we work, how we interact, how we connect. They were born, 2010 was the year that Instagram was launched. It was the year that the iPad was released. It was the year that the Oxford English Dictionary had word of the year as the word app. And it was the year that Generation Alpha began being born. So that tells a bit about their time, and they'll be quite the generation to keep an eye on as well. And we will be a bit more reflective. I touched on this as we reflect again of the role of work in our lives. And we will, over this decade, start to change that and see it not only as a place to earn the money to pay the bills, not only an exchange of time for earnings, but a place where we can make greater contributions. We're seeing workplaces change and look at their broader values, look at their environmental and social impacts, look at how they're looking after their teams and their staff, how they're training and bettering them and their futures. And so that will flow through, and the companies of the future will be those that do value their staff, input into their communities, and deliver more than just profit alone. And I think that's a healthy thing. You know, the fact is we're spending more than almost half of our waking hours at work. We're spending almost half of the years of our life at work. And people are saying, you know, work therefore has to deliver better well-being and mental health and community contributions and training and value of the organization, of the individual within that organization. So work will continue to expand and grow in terms of its offering in our lives and its impact in the community. And I think that's a great thing. It's not just the not-for-profits in 2030 that'll be adding value. It's the for-purpose organizations. They might be for-profit, but they're also for-purpose, and we'll see more of that into the future as well.
100%. You know, I think about a lot of my friends of businesses. They're setting up what's called a B Corp, and ultimately that is a business which is for-profit, but which thinks about its purpose, and that's just a wonderful way to operate. We've got, do you know what, Declan, we'll squeeze in your last question, and then we're going to say our thank yous. Should Generation Alpha look towards a future of lower consumption to offset the impacts that mass production is currently having on the climate? A quick light one to end on.
Well, great question. And yes, in fact, they're already doing that. You know, they have been aware of environmental sustainability from their youngest years. But here's the thing, they're not just learning about it, they are acting on it, and indeed influencing their parents, their households to think that way as well. So I think that organizations they work in, brands they buy from, just the community that they influence will respond positively environmentally. And one way of doing it is by looking at consumption and not just going after ever more. Sustainability in an environmental sense, but in a financial sustainability sense as well. So we're already seeing it now with this generation. Look at fashions that are more recycled rather than just going to the shop and buying new. They're going for the keep cup, not just ever more disposable. They're thinking about growing their own and producing their own food and making their own contributions, rather than, again, just this fast consumption mindset which has dominated this 21st century so far. So big turnaround with Generation Alpha, which is going to be great for the planet, and I think great financially for them as well. These financially conservative young people who are seeing the value of saving, not just ever more spending. And I think we can all learn a lot from them and will into the future.
100%. Well, look, Mark, a few things. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us, share your learnings and insights into the state of the world today and what we should be expecting to see going forward. Many things to be inspired by, hopeful for, and I guess a reminder that people always matter and community matters, which is, you know, what we've all gathered here to be part of. Thank you to everyone who joined. Some really great questions today. A quick reminder to everyone who's here, do invite somebody that you were on the DAV with to sign up and be part of the program. It's a growing and exciting community. The events are growing. We can act as mentors. We can support each other. And it's just a really interesting way to know that you were part of something where you met people in your younger years, and you can stay part of a much bigger network as time goes by and as you evolve. And as Mark says, even his children are now going to be part of DAV and will soon be alumni one day soon. I'm excited to speak to Peter Lawless for our next Alumni Connect, and I know that that the team will be sending out details about that for a couple of months' time. Mark, have a lovely evening where you are. To everybody, wherever you are in the world, really appreciate you joining us, and look forward to speaking to you again in a few months. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.